Alchemy is one of the most misunderstood aspects of Western esotericism. So misunderstood that I actually made a video about 5 of the common misconceptions I've heard about it. I was thinking about making an entire Introduction to Alchemy series here on the channel, and I thought, I kinda done that already. Last year, I was invited to the Flint Institute of Art to give a lecture on the artistic and technical side of alchemy. It's kind of an introduction to alchemy, and I hope it'll do until I actually make one for the channel. I hope you find it interesting. I'd like to thank the staff of the FIA for providing this video and for inviting me and hosting me, and I'd also especially like to thank Dr. Alan Klein for sponsoring the lecture. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and this is Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.
So what was alchemy? And how did it become what we know as the chemistry of today? Dr. Sledge will introduce the long-enduring practice and dispel common myths and discuss where our understanding of alchemy and proto-science is today. Dr. Sledge was born in Jackson, Mississippi. He received a master's in mysticism and esoteric philosophy from the University of Amsterdam and a master's and PhD in philosophy from the University of Memphis. He has written on the intersection of metaphysics and politics, often focusing on non-canon figures in the Western intellectual tradition. Dr. Sledge currently teaches philosophy and religious studies at Wayne State University. It has to be a challenge today to talk about the intersection of metaphysics and politics. I'm just kidding. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Sledge.
These things turned on. All right, thank you so much for having me back. It's amazing to be here in Flint. I'm so honored to be re-invited with the strange interest I have. Anytime I get invited back to somewhere, I'm like, all right, they're as strange as me. So thank you. So tonight I want to talk a bit about alchemy, where alchemy was, what it was, the history of it a little bit, and sort of the renaissance we're actually having in alchemy now. That might worry the chemists in the room, that we're having a renaissance of alchemy. But we are, in fact, and so I want to talk a bit about that tonight. Also, I bet you can hear I'm nursing a bit of a cold. So God willing, my voice will last. So my talk tonight is called Sublime Transmutation, the theory, the art, and the science of alchemy. And I say sublime because I really like this idea of the sublime for folks who've studied art, right? Kant really tells us that the sublime is the most powerful image, most powerful sensation of art. And I think part of what we get out of alchemy and why a big part of why alchemy remains so compelling is the art associated with it. These beautiful, symbolic representations of these sublime chemical processes that, on the one hand, reveal to us, or trying to reveal to us, what their mysteries are, and on the other hand, and significantly so, do a great job concealing, right, what's going on. So I think that's part of what's sublime about alchemy. It reveals and it conceals. It lures us in with these very strange and beautiful images, and then at the same time, it says, not so fast, right? You're not really initiated. You're not really initiated. So tonight I want to talk about a couple of misconceptions about alchemy. I think they're the 2 dominant ways, actually, we look at alchemy these days. And I think, unfortunately, both of them are slightly incorrect. They're slightly wrong in some sense. The first misconception that I think is often had about alchemy was that it was a kind of blundering pseudoscience more akin to magic than anything else, right? I think sometimes when we imagine the alchemists, we imagine them sitting there with their in their furnace, right, with their crucibles, and they're just pouring random things in and seeing what happens, and it blows up, and then God knows what happens, right? That alchemy is in some sense not any different fundamentally than just almost random mixing things together. That it in fact has more to do with magic or conjuring or fraud even than we think of it having to do with an actual experimental science. I think the chemists have all convinced us of this, right? The first day of chemistry class, we're not alchemists. And I think, to no insult to the chemists. But I think that's a misconception. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think that's a misconception. The second misconception I think we have of alchemy has to do with the idea that somehow the alchemists had nothing to do with chemical change. They weren't interested in experiments at all. That they, in fact, were really interested in spiritual or psychological transformation. So the alchemists laboring there in the dark, working on these chemical changes, actually no, right? What they were really interested in is like a somehow spiritual transmutation of the base parts of us, right? The lead that we are into the gold that we could be. And I think that's also a misrepresentation. I think that's also not what the alchemists were doing. So I think both of these capture something right, and then mostly they capture something incorrect. So what I want to do tonight is talk a little bit about where these misconceptions came from and kind of clear them up a little bit and give maybe perhaps a little bit more nuanced vision of alchemy, right? So where do they come from, right? Where did these ideas come from? Well, the first, right, the idea that alchemy was sort of blundering pseudoscience, more akin to conjuring, really comes out of the humanist tradition, right? They're really trying to distinguish themselves away from the Middle Ages, right? So when they call the handwriting of the Middle Ages Gothic, no one in the Middle Ages called their handwriting Gothic. Every single medieval piece of literature that you see written in those very tight, dense black letter hands, they call those litteris moderna, modern letters. It's the humanists that call it Gothic, right? And so a big part of this is also in the 19th century, right, separating themselves off from the past. So there's a political aspect about this as well. It's not just straightforwardly the alchemists were sort of incorrect. There's an axe to grind here, right? So also another big part of this is we've lost a lot of the actual information of what the alchemists produced. So when modern people, often chemists, look at an alchemical manuscript or alchemical imagery, they're completely at a loss as to what this stuff means. I mean, you get these long diatribes with these weird symbols and allegorical language and these very interesting sort of symbolic coded things. And if you turn this to a modern chemist or any modern person, they'll look at this and say, this is a bunch of crazy paganism or witchcraft or God knows. They don't know how to read these texts. And so what do? When we don't know how to read something? Those people were stupid. Well, stupidity might go this way, right? We might be misreading them, right? Not reading them correctly as opposed to us knowing everything and how to figure these things out. I think that's a misconception. I'll clear that misconception up a bit, I think, tonight. The other misconception, I think this is another idea that people have, right, is that the alchemists were unconcerned at all with chemical transmutation. That is to say, they were uninterested in trying to turn lead to gold. And I can tell you tonight, without any doubt in my mind, the average alchemist, all things told, was very interested in turning lead to gold. I am interested in turning lead to gold. You are interested in turning lead to gold. If you thought it was remotely possible, you would not be here. So trust me, they were interested in doing it. And that's not their only game. We'll talk more about the aims later. But this idea that really what alchemy is about the transmutation of the alchemists themselves, this is actually very, very late. This is a very late idea. In fact, the earliest person who really articulates this position is a great spiritualist named Marianne Atwood, who wrote a very long dissertation about this thesis about what alchemy is. There's a really great story to be told about her book, actually. She tried to prevent it from being published and burned all the copies, and some copies got out. Of course, it's like that. It's amazing. But really what we have is folks like Carl Jung. How many Jung people do I have tonight? Any folks who've read some Jung, and some Jung? I hope Carl Jung did not bring here. You may be disappointed. Carl Jung also, right? His writings on alchemy are amazing. And I have some things to say about them, but unfortunately I think that he often misses the point about what's going on in these alchemical texts. And this is also true of Mircea Eliade, who I imagine for any folks who do religious studies in the room, Eliade is also a cornerstone figure in the history of religious studies. And his great book, The Forge and the Crucible, while very interesting and very good to read, it's very clear to me that Eliade just doesn't really understand medieval alchemy very well. And it's not his fault. We're only now beginning to really understand it. We'll talk about that more later tonight. So you get the sort of the trifecta, right? You have Atwood, you have Carl Jung, and you have Eliade, and they're going to be the people that are going to give us this psychological or spiritual interpretation of the alchemical tradition. And this is very dominant in the New Age movement now. So if you go to modern lectures on alchemy, for instance, in the New Age movement, this will be the dominant way that they will interpret a lot of the imagery we'll see tonight. Now, am I here to tell anyone that their spiritual path is wrong or incorrect? Absolutely not. If you find spiritual nourishment in interpreting alchemical text according to a Jungian or otherwise like New Age or spiritualist path, great, right? I literally hold to a community that people think we gave us like commandments on a rock that we can't eat pork. So don't let me tell you that you can't believe it, right? It's always very important to be like, you point a finger and be like, haha, New Age people. They're like, you'd think a talking snake tricked a woman one time, right? We should be careful. We should be humble. So again, this idea, I think, obtains a great deal in spiritualist movements, and I think it's quite still popular, right? This is a very famous image here of Hermes Trismegistus, the founder, in some sense, of the alchemical tradition, thrice great Hermes. Here with the image of the sun and the moon representing silver and gold, respectively. So my contention tonight, what do I prove is a very strong word. What do I want to offer, right? What do I want to offer? You do what you like with it, right? I want to actually offer a bit of a more subtle read of both these positions. On the one hand, right? This is the one hand, over here. On the one hand, right, I want to say that alchemy was in fact experimental science. It was something very much like experimental science. Now, is it experimental science in the modern sense of the word? No. But it is an experimental idea that the way we gain knowledge is through experiment and we deduce things from previous experience. I will say that, and I will try to argue for that tonight. The second thing I want to argue for, right, is that it's not just a theory of physical transmutation. The idea that you're only looking at physical changes for the alchemist is completely unimaginable. For the alchemist, you're thinking about all of nature. And nature includes both the material, the psychological, and the spiritual. And that is a very common belief in the Middle Ages. We're talking about an idea where nothing is in isolation in the Middle Ages. We're thinking about a world in which everything is connected. Everything. From thoughts, to symbols, to plants, to animals, to the stars, to the chemicals in the laboratory. Everything is fundamentally connected. It is a theory of everything. So when you talk about alchemy, we're really talking about a theory of everything. So that's the second part, right? The third part here, right, is that it does actually have something to do with the spiritual and physical transmutation of the alchemists themselves. So don't hear me that I'm saying I'm throwing the sort of spiritualist interpretation of alchemy under the bus. I'm not, right? It's just not the primary focus of many alchemists in the Middle Ages. We'll make that point a little bit more subtle here in a bit. But really, alchemy is a total philosophy of nature. And I say nature, I mean all of it, even spiritual nature. Again, we think of nature as being sort of the physical world, but for the alchemist, we're talking about a spectrum that runs from everything from the lowest mote of dirt all the way to the divine seat of the Godhead. Everything for the alchemist was connected and interconnected. And so this is a very different theory. You can see this quite clearly here in this image. We have the, let me try to hit the right button. All right. We have this, this is a bain-marie. We'll talk about this more in a minute, right? This is a water bath heating up an alembic. Notice that this is before they have developed a condenser, right? So this is this charade. They're losing a ton of condensate out of that condenser. But notice here you have the two alchemists debating, right? And notice what's important here, right, is that you actually have astrological influence. So this is a very good representation of what the alchemists thought was going on. They are learning and teaching from each other. They are doing physical changes in the world, and yet the occult forces, astrological forces, are for them very important. Also, by the way, not every alchemist believed in astrology. Some did, some didn't. We'll talk about that more perhaps later on the night. So, what was alchemy, right? What was alchemy? The word alchemy is actually a bit of a mystery. Surprise, surprise. You're going to lecture about alchemy. The word is actually a bit of a mystery. We know that the al is an Arabic definite article, right? The. So, the what? The chem. The word chem probably comes from the Greek. We think it may have to do with the basic of the word chemical. I think a better contender actually is that we're dealing with an Egyptian word, right? The Egyptian word for Egypt was chem, which means the black. It may refer to the soil of that region, right? So we think that the actual word alchemy is in fact itself a bit of alchemy. It's a bit of Greek, it's a bit of Egyptian, and it's a bit of Arabic. And so what we get is the Egyptian thing, right? The Egyptian thing. And we're going to see in a minute. Yeah, it's way clear now, right? We can all leave. It's a bit of a mystery, but it has to do with the fact that many of the alchemists, much of alchemy is going to originate in Alexandria, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. So what was it, right? Alchemy was several theories of nature. And I say theories, there was never one alchemy, right? When so many people say, well, alchemy says this, and my question always is, which book you read, right? Because there are dozens of alchemists, and every alchemist has slight differences in their theories. Some big, some small, some believe in astrology, some don't, some believe that it's this, and some believe that it's that. There are lots of alchemical schools. When we get in a minute talking about sort of the overall ideas of alchemy, I'm going to give you the most general version of the theory. So it has to do with the creation and alteration of substances. That's really important, creation of substances. This is going to be incredibly controversial. Because in the same way that we now worry about, for instance, people engaging in genetic manipulation, right? What do we say, right? That they're playing God. That's our worry. The exact same worry was had about the alchemists in the Middle Ages. That they are in their weird laboratories, doing their weird stuff, and they're transforming things, and only God can do that, and they must be with the devil. That was a worry that people have with alchemists. But the creation and alteration of substances here, right? It's also the theoretical and practical knowledge. We're going to talk a lot about the theoretical and practical knowledge actually accumulated by the alchemists over the course of about 1,000 years, including their art and literature. There's a great deal of art and literature. I mean, every one of these slides is just literally one image from an alchemical book. There are dozens of these books that are available to us. And I said, Golden Age of Alchemy, we're in it. These are all available to us quite easily these days. It also includes the ability to transmute substances, right? And we'll talk about how they thought that was possible. Because the idea was that you could transmute this into this, turn this substance into this substance, turn another substance into another substance. That was something they were very interested in. We are also very interested in doing that. Also, the production of a universal solvent was very interesting to them, right? The idea of it's called an alchemist, the ability to produce a solvent that dissolves everything. But this leads to a logical problem. If you produce a solvent that dissolves everything, what do you put it in? Yeah. They knew it was a problem. Right, so now you have to produce the universal holder, right? So the universal solvent was a big idea of theirs, right? The production of medicine. Everybody here, me, myself, having a cold, I ingested chemicals that are suppressing the symptoms of my cold right now. That idea that you can ingest chemicals and suppress a cold, we will see coming out of the alchemical tradition. Their idea is that you can take things from the outside and balance things on the inside. That is an alchemical idea. We'll see it very highly developed by folks like Paracelsus. Although most of his medicine oriented around drinking mercury, so don't do that. And it's also the practices which allow for this, right? It's also the spiritual transformation. We'll talk about this toward the end. The alchemists had the deep idea, and I think this is a core lesson for us to learn as scientists today. For the alchemist, you didn't just get to transform anything you wanted if you were a bad person. You had to become spiritually and morally purified in order to accomplish the great work. So you couldn't just go into a lab and cook up nerve gas, right? No. The idea was if you were a bad person with bad intentions, God or nature would intervene and stop you. And unfortunately, I don't think they're right. But this is, I think, an important lesson. I tell my students, right, in my ethics classes, can does not imply should. Can does not imply should. And for the alchemists, that was a very core idea. Just because we can does not mean we should. Just because we can make gold does not mean we should. So I think this is an interesting idea in the Alchemists. Not that I'm not sure they can make gold, but I think this is an important moral and ethical lesson. So some history. Let's do some history of alchemy. There have been craftspeople throughout the ages who have known all kinds of things about how to do chemical transformations of reality. I list a lot of them here, right? Brewers, I'm a brewer, so I list brewers. Right? Brewers and cooks and smiths and jewelers and dyers, fullers, assayers, glassmakers. All of these people and all of these crafts had all kinds of chemical knowledge going all the way back to ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia and before. So it's not like when alchemy comes on the scene, they're inventing things from scratch. What we will see with the alchemist is, even though they don't develop things from scratch, they synthesize things from all of these different crafts in a way that none of the other crafts did previously. It's really the Greeks that are really going to make the breakthrough. And the Greeks are going to ask a very basic question. They're going to ask a question beginning of 7th and 6th centuries BCE, folks like Thales. What is nature? What is nature most fundamentally? And they're going to begin debating that issue. And you're going to get theories. Thales is going to say it's all water. Democritus is going to say, no, it's tiny little things you can't cut anymore. They're atomos. They're atoms. Right? Other people are going to say all kinds of other things. And they're going to begin debating what fundamentally is reality. And that debate is going to be published and disseminated and altered and checked. So when we get from the practical side of these craftspeople, we combine it with this theoretical side from this Greek world, and we're going to see when we get to Aristotle here in a minute, they're going to have a theory for why things are the way they are, and then techniques for altering them. When we combine those two things, techniques for altering them from the craft world and the Greek theoretical world, why things are the way they are, now we're going to have a systematic program by which to change reality itself. And that is going to be the project of the alchemists. Right? This breakdown is, I think, incredible. It has a weakness, though, right? The main weakness, as I'm sure many scientists in the room know, is that the Greek way of doing science was to deduce really, really elegant ideas and then go looking for evidence to prove them. That doesn't work. If you've ever argued with a conspiracy theorist, you know. You can always find reasons to believe things, right? No matter how bizarre or whatever they are. The Greeks did science this way, right? The Greeks did knowledge production this way, and it led them astray. We'll talk more about that in a bit, but it led them astray. By the way, this is one of the earliest diagrams from Euclid. This is one of the earliest, if you ever struggled through Euclid, this is one of the earliest examples of a diagram here from Euclid. By the way, the Euclideans were downstream from the Pythagoreans, and the Pythagoreans believed everything was fundamentally composed of numbers. So water, numbers, whatever. You had all kinds of going theories in the ancient Greek world about what things were. I think we still believe that, by the way. I mean, how much time do you spend doing math in your physics classes? Yeah, it's weird that the numbers seem to be what we're obsessed with, right? Maybe the numbers are just all there really are, right? That's certainly what Pythagoras thought. There was a huge breakthrough in the Alexandrian world, right? The huge breakthrough was technological. In the Alexandrian world here, around the turn of the Common Era, it's difficult to say this, but they invented distillation, right? They invented the steam engine. They invented the water bath. Can you imagine, right? If the steam engine would have taken hold in the Alexandrian world the way that it did in the 1700s for us. Think about it. There's a whole book to be written where someone plays that out, right? Where the steam engine, invented by Hero of Alexandria, right? Because how many years was it after the steam engine we were on the moon? Yeah, about 300 years, a little less, right? Imagine if we were on the moon the same year that Christianity was legalized. 325. There's no reason why that couldn't have happened. And again, we have, for any engineers, Hero of Alexandria designed the steam engine and the first vending machine, by the way. It's sort of weird you get both, but you get these breakthroughs, right? Many of the early alchemists, including the writer of this alchemical text, were women. So this is also a world in which women could compete with men for knowledge production. We know of a famous alchemist here named Cleopatra. We also know of a woman known as Miriam the Jewess, who invented the bain-marie. So anyone who does any French cooking, the bain-marie is still named after her. That name comes directly from the alchemical tradition. It's a water bath distillation, right? So you can hold temperature a bit more steady in that form of distillation. If you've ever had many forms of whiskey, most whiskey is actually distilled on a bain-marie. Brandy almost always is done on a bain-marie. So if you've ever had any brandy, thank Maria the Jewess. So also at this time, all the major aspects of alchemy are in place. By the Alexandrian period, all the major aspects of alchemy are in place. Let's give you a couple examples of these. One, the worldview is in place. This is a famous image of the snake eating its own tail, right? This is the Ouroboros, the tail eater, right? The idea that everything is one. In fact, if you read Greek minuscule, you can read hin to pan, all is one, right? Everything is connected. A fundamental idea in alchemy. Here we have the tripikos, right? Here you can see the distillation arms and the main distillation unit. Here again, notice there's no condenser or very little condenser here to speak of. This was the distillation apparatus invented by either Cleopatra or Mary the Jewess, we're not sure. But again, if you drink whiskey, you can thank a woman. Behind every drink whiskey was a woman alchemist. So again, the technical achievement here, the philosophical achievement, and also the esoteric achievement. This, folks, is the earliest formula we have for the production of gold from base metals. It's from Zosimos of Alexandria, probably sometime around the 2nd or 3rd century. And it's completely clear. I have gold waiting for you here. I'll pass it out when you leave. No, we have no idea what this means. We do know that it's involving chrysopoeia, which means gold making in Greek. So if you want to do the work of deciphering this, feel free to destabilize our economy. So this is the earliest. It's called the formula of the crab, but exactly what it means is, well, mysterious. But again, all the major aspects of alchemy are here, right? You have the philosophical element, with the technical element, we have this sort of esoteric, occult technique. So the Alexandrian world, sort of the crucible of alchemy, forgive my pun, it's really the Islamic world where we get alchemy really develops into a science, a technically sophisticated process, right? And I say Islamic, I say Islamic because the Islamic world is not just Muslims, right? There are Christians and Jews and all kinds of people there. So when I say Islamic, I mean the wider world of the Arab conquest. Indeed, right? The word alchemy is a Greco-Arabic Egyptian word. And many of the really exotic words we get actually in alchemy that are very confusing to Europeans, and they think, oh, you're hiding things, right? They're actually just Arabic words, right? So alcohol, right? The black, elixir, alembic, athanor, which is literally the word for furnace in Arabic. And azoth, you'll see the word azoth, right? Many alchemists, although this is a great esoteric word, if you know the real meaning of the azoth, you'll control all things. In fact, it has the last letter of the Greek, Arabic, the Greek, Hebrew, and Latin alphabet in it, right? It just is from al-Zolq, which means Mercury in Arabic. So it's one of these things where, like, if you don't know what it means, it has to be magical. So again, what passes for esotericism, right, it's just actually Arabic. It's in this period of time where we actually develop what's called the sulfur-Mercury theory. I have an example of that theory operating currently. Here it is. The sulfur-Mercury theory, we'll see, is the idea that all metals are fundamentally composed of sulfur and mercury. And if you put them in some combination and seal them, you can get gold. I'm waiting. Still no gold. In this time period, acids are actually introduced, right? So we have Aqua Regia is actually developed this time, Aqua Fortis, we have hydrochloric and sulfuric acid. Nitric acid is also invented by the Arab alchemists at this time. Alcohol is distilled in a very elaborate way. In fact, the Arab Muslims were making perfume out of it. They were making perfumes, which are still made largely with alcohol. It wasn't until Christian monks, Irish monks, came down and said, if we put beer in here, what comes out? And they said, oh, this is really good. Ishkiva, the water of life. Whiskey. All right, so again, all right, we think that probably happened somewhere in either France or Italy. We're not actually sure where alcohol was first distilled for consumption. Although we do, the oldest distilleries in Europe are in the Armagnac region of France. So if you're an Armagnac drinker, that is a long-standing tradition going all the way back to the alchemical period. Key alchemists at this time, right, are also just key scientists at this time you may recognize, right? Jabir ibn Hayyan, Al-Razi, Ibn Sina, for any doctors in the room. Ibn Sina is probably one of the principal writers of medical documents in the ancient world. The Turba Philosophorum, the Congress of the Philosophers, is written by an Arab alchemist at this time. And the famous Emerald Tablet For anyone in here who practices in the sort of esoteric world, the Emerald Tablet is sort of the mainstay of this, right? Folks have heard this idea, as above, so below. You've heard this kind of language before? That's the Emerald Tablet. It was developed primarily in Arab lands early on. We just actually found in the last 20 years the actual original Arabic version of it. This is from an Arabic alchemical manuscript. That kind of distillation apparatus is exactly the same kind you'll still see used in the Cognac region of France. It has not fundamentally changed in 1,000 years. So that is still the exact same apparatus for distilling cognac. Alchemy enters Europe. We have the birthday for, I'm proposing tonight, folks, we have Alchemy Day, February 11th, 1144. This is the birth date of alchemy in Europe. We have Robert of Chester's translation of the composition of alchemy, which you can read online. It enters in Europe at 1144, and it spreads rapidly. People are very taken up with alchemy for obvious reasons. You can transmute things and other things. And this sparks a big conversation in Europe, the European tradition. Can you make things by yourself, or are you playing God? And that's part of what makes alchemy very, very nerve-wracking to many people. The idea is, you can't make things, God makes things. We can mix things together, but you can't make stuff from other stuff. Like, I can't transmute a lamb into a horse. You can't go from species to species. Why do you think you can go from lead to gold? And the alchemists were like, because we know how to transmute stuff. And they were like, that's witchcraft. Don't do that. So there's a debate that's going to go on in the alchemical world about that question. Can you transform nature by art? Right? Artificial, right? We still use this word. Artificial literally means to make it through art. These are really famous alchemists here. Albertus Magnus is a pretty famous alchemist. You may have heard he's a teacher of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas himself also was probably a practicing alchemist. Raimondo Lull and some other folks who are also of great renown, right? So alchemists here practicing in a little medieval manuscript from the 14th century. Alchemy reaches its high point in the 16th and 17th centuries. We'll talk more about why then. It also reaches its low point in the 16th and 17th centuries. That is to say, many of the most beautiful pieces of alchemical art come from this time. Also, alchemists are the best able to control their implementation at this time. It's also the time period where we have constant fraud. That is to say, there's all kinds of ways of tricking people into making them believe you can make lead to gold. I'll give you one example in case you want to do this. Don't do this. You can take a crucible, you make a false bottom, you put gold dust in the false bottom, right? You take the crucible, put it in the fire, right? It heats up, you add your other stuff in, right? And you pour it out, and out drops a lump of gold. Then you convince your local prince, well, if I could do that, if I could transform a tiny little bit of lead to all this gold, why don't you pay me a bunch of money, and I'll just do this for you. And they would pay them a bunch of money, and guess what happened to that alchemist? Yeah, unless I caught them. Yep, they would catch you. This is a gold-plated gibbet. And they would hang you from a gold-plated gibbet and leave you there. That was the common punishment for alchemists to engage in fraud. So you're going to play gold? We'll play gold. Right? Notice he is wearing gold. Right? So the constant threat of fraud. Also, in this time period, we have the alchemist who has, without a doubt, the best name of anyone in history, Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, better known as Paracelsus, whose name literally means better than Celsus. Celsus was an ancient Roman doctor. Paracelsus really dramatically changes the way we do medicine, and changes the way we do alchemy. He's really the bridge between the medieval world of alchemy and sort of the more modern world of what we might call chemistry. He's great to read his writings. He just like curses like a sailor. It's just really great to read him. He'll just like call people like scheisskopf to their face. And you're like, wow, this is a learned man. He's telling me this is like Martin Luther wrote that way too. It's a journey. It's really all about it. So, or the Swiss at least, right? So again, lots of alchemy is in to be found here, but also lots of fraud. By the late 17th century, the attack on the traditional theories of nature are really total at this time. Aristotle is coming under massive attack. This is, of course, the very famous image of the Skeptical Alchemist, which is the 1651 text, which is taught to be the origin of modern chemistry. They don't tell you that Robert Boyle practiced alchemy to the day he died. He was like, yeah, I live in chemistry, but for real, this alchemy thing's where it's at. So Boyle, Newman too, we'll talk about him in a minute, they both practiced alchemy. Alchemy persisted, by the way, all the way to the mid-19th century. Again, we should always remember that the atom was not completely proven until the early 20th century. So even by the early 20th century, you could still be like alchemist on the side. Be like, yeah, I'm a chemist, but like, I'm hedging my bets. Retirement program, right? So again, even at this time period, we are really seeing a transition from alchemy into chemistry. In fact, scholars actually refer to this period as chemistry. We spell it wrong on purpose to indicate the sort of no man's land in between both. Where on the one hand, they are increasingly isolating chemicals from each other, but at the same time, still doing this transmutation business. All right, how did alchemy work? We can blame this guy. It's always a guy with a beard. Don't trust these people. This is Aristotle from the school at Athens, right? It's Aristotle's theory we can blame here. He can blame it on Empedocles. He stole the theory from Empedocles. I bet you all know his theory, right? Aristotle said there are 4 fundamental things that exist, right? Air, water, fire, and earth, right? And there are 2 principles, right? There's a masculine principle and a feminine principle. And because everything is some combination of these 4 chemicals, and you can see them here, right? Earth, water, air, fire. Also, here's the music of the worlds, which is nice. The Pythagorean music of the worlds is in this illustration. Well, it's a basic theory, folks. If everything that exists is some combination of these 4 things, and if nature produces them by manipulating those 4 things in different ratios, then you can decompose them out of those ratios, reconstitute them in some other ratio, and change one thing to another. That's the theory. It's a theory. Again, this is a far better theory, Aristotle's theory, than Hesiod's theory at the time, which was the gods made everything and we can't change anything. That was the dominant theory back then, right? Right? The idea was, well, Poseidon shakes the waters and that makes earthquakes, so sorry, pray. You know, do sacrifices. Aristotle's coming up with at least a theory, right? That says, here is an actual theory about what's going on, here's how we can actually manipulate the world based on how this goes. What gets developed in the Islamic world is that these 2 principles, right, the cold, moist principle and the warm, dry principle become represented by actual metals. And you can see here, by the way, this is Thomas Aquinas. And if you see here, this is the image of sulfur and this is the image of mercury. They're deep within the earth, and there are these exhalations, according to Islamic alchemists, that depending on various kinds of forces working on sulfur and chemistry, sulfur and mercury, they actually end up becoming different kinds of things. So if the exact best ratio happens, it becomes gold. If there are less, you know, it's not so hot, not so cold, or whatever, it becomes silver, copper, iron, tin, etc. This is a theory for why metals differ from each other, right? They are all cooked in the earth, and the idea is, as they're cooked in the earth, they're changed into different kinds of things, and when we get them at various stages of that transmutation. Well, the idea is simple, folks. Simple enough, at least. You can take your alchemical egg, I have mine here, you seal it, you hermetically seal it, right? This is where we get the term hermetically sealed. So there's nothing on the outside, and you subject it to these various forces. You distill it, you calcinize it, you smash it, you heat it, you do all kinds of things to it. You emulate the processes inside the earth, and if you emulate those processes perfectly, well, you'll turn for that sulfur and mercury into what are some metals, right? Tin, whatever. And they had good experimental evidence to believe this, right? One thing they found is if you take baths of copper sulfate and put steel or iron into it, the end transmutes. Now, we now know that's not what's not actually happening, but miners noticed this for a long time. The copper bound to the iron. The iron was transmuting. Well, that's not what's happening, but they thought this was happening. So the basic idea here is you have to put them through these 12 processes, right? Now, these 12 processes vary widely from alchemist to alchemist. So you start with calcination, right? Smashing things up like mercury and gold, right? Making a powder of them. And you go all the way through these different kinds of processes all the way to projection. And projection allows you to introduce the pure version of sulfur and mercury into a base metal, and it will instantly convert it to gold. right? You can skip all those processes. That's the underlying theory behind alchemy. You can see it here in this really beautiful illustration, right? You can see the alchemical egg, right? Hermetically sealed, and you can see this great illustration here of the process of the fight going on inside here. And a great deal of heating and things is going on in order to do this process. So this 12-step process will go also by colors. That's how you know you're doing it right. It will go from black, which, by the way, if you take sulfur and mercury, you put them into a vessel like this. You can't see it here, but it starts off black, right? The sulfur and the mercury interact, and you get, I forget the name of the compound, but you get this sort of mixture of them, and they are, in fact, quite black, especially if you add a heat to it. You go from black to white, to yellow, and finally to red. And if the chemical turns red, which you can see here, the chemical here is turned red, you know you are now on the road toward the Philosopher's Stone. That is to say, the pure elemental stuff capable of transmuting one substance to another. Now, along the way, you get all kinds of other stuff. You could get medicines. You could get the universal solvent, the alchemist we talked about earlier. And you could get all kinds of potions for extending life. Not making you immortal. By the way, in Chinese alchemy, making you immortal was a big part of Chinese alchemy. You could never become immortal in European alchemy. Why? Sin. You have to die. The wages of sin is death. So immortality was never in the game for the alchemists of this. Although there are stories of alchemists living to 200-300 years with their alchemical potions. Nicholas Flamel allegedly lived a very, very, very long life on his alchemical techniques. Now, the exact starting substance, how this proceeded, and how it all worked, varies widely from alchemical text to alchemical text. Not only very widely, but the actual symbolic representations of this are very unclear, right? They're intentionally concealed so that you have to know, right? If you're in the know, you know. But if you don't know, we're not going to tell you. You have to figure it out. So they give you clues along the way. The alchemists are famous for giving you these kinds of clues. So again, we can see these very famous, this is a Vatican manuscript here. We can see very famous images here of Mercury, right? Mercury is being transmuted, right, into various forms. And again, the various kind of elements dumping out of those chemicals. These crucibles, by the way, you can see them here. I brought some tonight from my own collection. These crucibles that I have here were discovered in an archaeological dig, then put on the private market from around Utrecht. They are, in fact, recovered from an alchemical lab. This one was used. I don't know what was in there. I probably shouldn't be touching it, but you know what. They're called Hessian Crucibles, and they're nested inside each other like this. So they're like little Russian dolls. These crucibles date from sometime in the 17th century. It's the high days of alchemy. You're welcome to come up and take a look at it if you like. They're famous. They're Hessian crucibles. They're named from a specific area of Germany where the soil there contains a little bit of aluminum. And so when they're fired, they actually become very, very resistant to heat damage. So you can get these crucibles incredibly hot without them being damaged. Like I said, only one of them has been used, which is kind of neat, actually. So we can take our alchemical stuff over here, put these crucibles, and fire it up. We can make some gold. Trust me, I've tried. I've no success. Now, while all this stuff strikes us as obscure and esoteric, you have to understand, every single discipline in the Middle Ages had its technical jargon. Every single discipline has its technical jargon now. Again, I dare you to walk into a chemistry lab and ask them what they're doing. And if you're not a chemist, it's going to sound like Greek to you. Right? Go into a programming lab where they're programming computers and ask them what they're doing. It's going to sound like Greek to you. The alchemists have their own technical jargon vocabulary. Now, just because it's technical and jargon-laden does not mean it's completely incoherent. We'll talk more about the fact that we can read a lot of this now. We actually have a good idea of what's going on in these texts. So the basic idea here is, folks, the underlying theory, this is an image from Gerber, this is his book on furnaces. The underlying theory is never going to work. The truth of the matter is, transmutation is effectively impossible. We'll talk about the one exception to this in a minute, but there was never going to be a possibility of actually following through with this Aristotelian theory and transmuting one element into another. It's simply not possible given the mechanisms that the alchemists had. However, this is what really makes the alchemy important. They never gave up. They carefully described the processes they were engaging in. And all of these techniques, right? So I'm going to go back a couple slides. All of these techniques, right? Calcination, solution, separation, conjunction, cybation, fermentation, all of these require enormous amounts of practical chemical knowledge to do, right? Fermentation, if you've ever made beer, it's easy to muck it up. You have to be very, very carefully skilled in order to pull fermentation off correctly, right? Things like distillation, solution, the development and the production of acids is very technically sophisticated. So on the way to the production of the Philosopher's Stone, the attempt to transmute one chemical into another, they discovered a wealth of things. All kinds of techniques. By the way, the exact same techniques you will still see in a chemistry lab today. They're highly perfected now, but they were really beta tested in the alchemical labs of the Middle Ages. Again, this is still head, right? Without this slide from the condenser I'm missing here. It's not that unusual for the stillhead you walk into and see in a lab today. The big transition happened in the late Middle Ages, the early modern period, the rise of what we call entrepreneurial alchemy. Now, I'll give you an idea of what happened in entrepreneurial alchemy. So, one thing you could do is you could go tell a prince you could make gold. And then you could fail. And we all know what happened to him. The gold-plated gibbet. Maybe you didn't do that, right? But what could you do? You could make acids. You could make glass. You could make cosmetics. You could make paint, right? You could distill alcohol. You could produce chemically pure substances like potassium nitrate. And you can imagine why, in the early 17th century, many European princes got really interested in you making very pure potassium nitrate. You want to know why? Gunpowder. Gunpowder. Right? Because guess what? If you got the gunpowder, you get the gold. Right? Again, if I get a gun and point at you like, give me all your gold, you're like, oh, I didn't expect that to be alchemy, but you just robbed me, okay. Right? So again, the ability to produce very high quality individual chemical compounds, right, drove the alchemists away from trying to transmute gold. They would still try that late at night, I'm sure, right? Also, they were moving in the directions of actually producing these chemical pure substances. Also, another thing that's worth pointing out here, right, is by the 17th century, you can very clearly track in Europe when there's a lot of books written on alchemy and when there are what we call precious metal famines. That is to say, when the amount of gold and silver in Europe drops. So when mines dry up, guess what happens? Alchemy gets real interesting. Why? Because there's just not enough silver and gold in these European places to keep the economy afloat. And when there's a lot of gold and silver, interest in alchemy drops. You can trace this in a graph. I say you can, we have. It's well established. Well, guess what happens in the 17th century? The mining situation opens up dramatically. There are tons of silver mines in Central and Eastern Europe. Gold's flowing in from Africa. If you have enough gold and enough silver, guess what you don't need anymore? Johann the Alchemist, making a nugget of gold, and God knows how he did it. Right? So, again, other factors are going to intervene on the alchemists. So on the one hand, alchemy will come to an end. On the other hand, it will persist by another name, doing different kinds of things. So anyone tells you alchemy is dead and gone, absolutely not. They just got more profitable. They got tired of being hanged from gold-plated gibbets. Also, by the way, at the same time, Aristotle's theories are coming under constant attack, right? Galileo is attacking Aristotle. Everybody's attacking Aristotle. And increasingly we're finding out it doesn't seem like he's right. Turns out he was practically wrong about everything. I feel bad for Aristotle. He's such a... I mean, can you imagine inventing every domain of knowledge and being effectively wrong about all of them? It's like, can the guy get biology or something? I feel bad for poor Aristotle, but this is increasingly what happened. Alchemy didn't die by any stretch of the imagination. These are one page of 1,000,000 words written by no less than Isaac Newton on alchemy. He wrote in a ratio of 10 to 1 science to alchemy. Science to alchemy. He was far more interested in alchemical processes and Bible interpretation of the apocalypse than he was in inventing physics or calculus. In fact, the only reason why he ever claimed calculus is someone else claimed it. He was like, I did that first. Right? It was a complete afterthought for him. really what mattered for him was the alchemy. And you see these beautiful alchemical ideas here, right? This is the lapis philosophoris, right? The philosopher's stone. And this is the various colors things should turn as they go. This process was not abrupt by any stretch of the imagination. Alchemy slowly transformed into what we would call chemistry, and then chemistry slowly transformed into what we would now call modern chemistry. It wasn't like one came to an end and one began. Like they just broke up one day. We're divorced. It's over. It's not working out. The idea here is a very slow process by which this happens, right? So all the way back from Paracelsus's idea that the sulfur-mercury theory is wrong, he added an element, salt. So again, it's a small change, but it was a dramatic change given the alchemical theory of the day. To the production of specific chemicals for industrial use, like we talked about potassium nitrate. To Boyle's introduction of the corpuscular theory, right? The idea that there are these tiny little pieces of stuff that are what exists. Also to the moving methodologically away from the idea that you go looking for evidence. Descartes introduced the idea of radical doubt. How do you find the truth? You doubt your way to the truth. You don't believe your way to it. That is a methodological shift of dramatic importance. And that was going to be a huge shift in the way we did science, as opposed to the way the alchemy. Because again, if you believe that the adepts have converted lead to gold, you're going to go looking for how they did it. You're never going to ask yourself, did they do that? Right? And again, the shift here was a general shift away from this sort of a larger paradigm away from Aristotle to a kind of skepticism about how things are going to work. It's a great painting here, actually, from the 19th century. It's depicting, in some sense, what we think happened. This is an alchemist here doing some distillation work. His vessel breaks, and out of it flows phosphorus, pure phosphorus. He's isolated an element. He didn't know it, but he's done the work of isolating an element. We'll see the same thing with people like Priestley and other folks who will do the same thing with oxygen and stuff like that. Doing alchemy, realizing, hold on, maybe these are elements, and maybe not salt, sulfur, and mercury. Folks, we are in a golden age of alchemical research. And I say golden age, I really do mean there are more texts available to you, to us as scholars, than ever before. I can literally go online and I can download the entire works of alchemical writers that were literally available in 2 libraries in Europe up until now. Google is scanning a ton of these books and they are available to us. And we're now, for the first time in history, actually being able to trace which alchemists influence other alchemists and how. What are they learning from each other? How are they tweaking their experiments? How are they learning that if you do this, this weird gas comes off, and that gas is combustible, and you have to be really careful? Right? How do we trace this stuff out? And we're finally realizing that these alchemists were not bumbling around. They were communicating, they were writing letters, they were publishing, they would publish a book, realize it was misprinted, take it back, republish it, and warn their original reader. Don't do it that way. That was bad. We're getting a very good sense now, right? That the alchemists were not engaged in willy-nilly, just add whatever you like, just like whatever you like these chemicals. We're getting a very strong sense they're engaging in experimentation, right? They're engaging in experimentation. Excuse me, one more. Universal medicine. Acetaminophen. In fact, we're learning that the founders of the so-called scientific revelation are scientific innovation, are actually much more complicated than we ever thought before. Newton, Boyle, other people, again, we think of these as the founders of science. They're spending the vast majority of their time doing things we would now associate with the occult, rather than science. We're getting a far better vision of what these people were actually like in their private time. In fact, research into alchemy is now a niche, but it's a respectable field. I do research into alchemy. When I say I do research into alchemy, no one looks at me and thinks to themselves, oh God, one of those people. That probably do, actually. But they publish my papers. You can publish accounts, right? There's an entire journal called Ambics, dedicated largely to the history of alchemy. Now, the history of alchemy, right? There's a great famous saying, right? Nonsense is nonsense, but the history of nonsense, that's science. As long as you're doing it historically, right? But it's not just historically, folks. This is a modern reproduction of an alchemical experiment, right? Sort of Newton's attempts to make vitriol, right? Aqua fortis, right? Which, if you've ever studied alchemical, folks, how many folks have here have a background in alchemy or studied alchemy a bit before? Nobody. Oh, yeah. Right? If you've ever, one of the most famous images you'll ever see in alchemy is the green lion devouring the sun. It's a very common image. It's just like the image, if you've ever read Jung and other folks, this is the image he always comes back to, the lion devouring the sun. No one had any idea what this was until we discovered the fact that the alchemists actually invented Aqua Regia. Aqua Regia is an acid that will, in fact, dissolve gold. Well, we didn't know that they could really do this. It's actually technically very sophisticated to do. Well, what do? This is actually Newton's exact recipe for creating Aqua fortis. And then we recreated it using, things that won't quite kill us as easily. So again, you can see a distillation apparatus here, and being gathered the Aqua fortis, the Aqua Regia there, and with across the sensor, right, we can actually reproduce Newton's experiment down to the T. That is to say, we can actually reproduce what the alchemists did and learn why they did what they did. Realizing now, they were never just messing around, fooling around, they're accidentally discovering things. They had methodological processes by which they fundamentally trying to figure things out. So again, we are now living in a great period. Again, if you literally can go and get a PhD in chemistry, and you can spend a good bit of your time doing what we now call forensic chemistry, recreating the chemistry of the ancient world, the alchemy of the ancient world, which I think is actually quite fascinating. What do they say? Who laughs last, laughs best. Yeah, turns out you can transmute lead into gold, right? Now, you need a particle accelerator. I have one home. It's in my basement. Yeah, you can do it. In 1980, folks out at the LBNL were actually able to transmute very thin sheets of bismuth foil into gold. Bismuth, by the way, is right there next to lead, right? So right there next to lead, and they were able to do this. Transmutation was possible. I'm sure the alchemists all, like, in their graves, were like, hooray. Now, the problem, that was the good news. The bad news. The amount of gold created was so minute that you had to effectively have very sophisticated technology to even notice it was there. If you got close to it, it was highly radioactive, so it would transmute you and you're dead. And it would cost about $1 quadrillion to make an ounce of it. But we did it. So again, who laughs last laughs best. And this leads me to my last point of the night, folks, or my next to last point. And this is the image, right? It's a very famous image here of the green lion devouring the sun, right? The Aqua Regia. Alchemy was neither of the things we think it was. It was neither folly and ridiculous nonsense, people sort of laboring stupidly over something that was always doomed to produce nothing. That simply isn't true. The entire practical operation that we now know as chemistry comes out of those processes. Now, was it fundamentally based on a wrong assumption about nature? Sure, right? Do you really want to look back in the past and be like, y'all got it wrong, y'all are stupid? No, let's be humble. They were laboring carefully over 1,000 years, 2,000 years, trying to develop these techniques, and they did an amazing job to do so. So we should be respectful of what the alchemists did, even if fundamentally we know they were never going to transmute lead to gold, right? That just wasn't in the cards. But the side projects here are incredibly important. Also, by the way, right, I don't want to throw the idea that the alchemical ideal, the idea that the process of transmuting base metals, things like lead into gold, was simply about profit. Now, there certainly were alchemists out there trying to make a buck. I'd be one of them. But again, for the alchemists, for many alchemists, right, I think the best work of alchemy at this time is the work of pseudo-geber. Pseudo-geber says at the very beginning of the book, look, if you're here for greed, just put the book down. If you're here to do bad stuff, put the book down. Because fundamentally, nature will right you. God will right you. And if you're here to create problems and struggles and evil with this, it will get found out and you will be destroyed. So there's an idea in alchemy that fundamentally we are responsible not just for what we make, but for who we are. And I think, right, and this is what the last idea I want to land on, there's something about this idea that all is one, right? That a philosophical idea is as above, so below. Right? The famous image here of the Ouroboros, right? The snake eating its own tail. I think one of the lessons we can take from alchemy, one of the lessons I take from alchemy, is that science has a responsibility not just to create and destroy, right? But it has a moral responsibility to create what allows human beings and the rest of creatures on this planet to flourish. Because if we simply think of nature as something we can extract from, that we can transform, that we can just take from, we're all seeing the consequences of that mentality. And I think the alchemists would have never made that step. For the alchemists, they were always in a dialectic, in a relationship with nature. As they transformed nature, they were transformed. And as they transformed themselves, only then could they further transform nature. This idea that we can simply extract from nature, we can take from nature, we can transform nature any way we like, I think is irresponsible. And I fundamentally think it's a lesson we could learn from our alchemical forebears. Thank you.
Welcome back. I hope you found it interesting. Sorry for jumping in and out of the frame there, and I hope the audio is okay. And also my apologies for Jung's dates. I think I placed him in the 17th century, making him several hundred years old. It's a kind of Jungian slip, if you get what I mean. At any rate, I hope you found the video interesting. I've included some recommended readings in the description below. I hope you'll check those out. Alchemy is going to be a mainstay here at Esoterica, so I hope you'll subscribe and consider supporting us at Patreon. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.